Ken Lopez is an antiquarian used book dealer and author archive broker dealer agent. We can explore all of those. Based in Hadley, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you very much.
As I mentioned, I was watching your video on the ABAA website. That was some time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very intrigued by the fact that you had decided against signing up to go to Vietnam and gone underground. You went underground for 5 years.
That's right, yeah.
And that informed some very interesting things that you've done in the book world.
Well, it certainly did leave me wondering after the war had ended and after the statute of limitations on my particular crime had passed. How was my life different from those of my peers who made one decision differently than I did? And that made me want to see if I could find others' accounts of their time in Vietnam and descriptions of their experiences. And it was not that easy to do, but this was right around the time that books like A Rumor of War were coming out. And when I read that, I thought this was very interesting. And I started looking for other books that had been written by people who had served in Vietnam. And
this was A Rumor of War is what? Who's that by?
It's Philip Caputo, and he served as a Marine in Vietnam and then later went back as a journalist. And it was one of the first wave of books. Dispatches by Michael Hare came out the following year. One of the first wave of books after the war to look back on it and kind of examine it from the perspective of the individual as opposed to the strategic analysis, historical analysis.
So what it gave, in effect, was the other, if you'd have taken the other path, it gave you an idea of what that might have looked like.
Exactly. And I was interested to know. I was in a writing program at the time in a kind of experimental college, Goddard College. I don't know if I mentioned that in the ABA.
You did, yeah.
And one of my classmates in the writing class was a Vietnam vet. He'd come back fairly recently, and he and I didn't have a lot of common experiences, but we got along really well at some fundamental level. And I was interested to know, without wanting to pry into his life and what his particular experience there had been, what it was that could have caused us to have a bond or be able to recognize something in each other that was very sympathetic. And that was kind of led me toward looking for these books people had written about Vietnam. And it was hard to do at the time. There were not that many of them. A number of them had been published and sunk into obscurity very quickly. So there was this whole sense of kind of following your nose, reading the blurb on one book to find out that another book existed and then looking for it. So anyway, then in doing that, I put together a big collection of Vietnam War literature that I then decided, not many people know about all these books. And
at this point, were you a book scout?
I was a book scout, yeah. And maybe in the first couple of years of being a book dealer, more than a scout. I did an actual catalog of my Vietnam collection and offered it for sale as a collection.
And so what was your you got this book by Caputo,
mm-hmm.
and you read it, and you were, profoundly affected
very
by
moved,
it?
Yeah, very moved.
At what point did you say to yourself, these types of books are really valuable descriptions of something that's really important to the American nation?
Well, if you mean valuable in terms of meaningful and important,
that's what
immediately.
I mean.
Yeah. The idea of being valuable in terms of money didn't come until much, much later, and even then it was really not so much the individual books as the books in aggregate represented something, a body of information about Vietnam from kind of the grunt's eye view.
So that was the idea that came to your mind, was I'm going to get a grunt's eye view of what took place.
The people who would have been me in Vietnam writing about their stuff. I wasn't going to be an officer. If I had been there, I'd have been a soldier, Yeah. And so no, kind of trying to understand what it had been like to do that and be there. And it was very painful. Those books are pretty horrifying in lots of ways. But they're pretty edifying in some ways too. I mean, it was really an eye-opener to realize how much love there was in those stories, a lot of camaraderie, the kind of bonds that, would be forged between people because of hardship and duress.
And was there a bitterness as well?
There was plenty of bitterness, yeah. It was funny. I did several catalogs of 60s literature and Vietnam literature combined. And in one of them I wrote in an introduction that it was funny that the kind of peace and love of the 60s literature often seemed to be infused with a kind of bitterness about the way things were. And the kind of war stories often seemed to have this kind of camaraderie and love that, one was nastier and the one was more kind than you would expect. You would have thought just the opposite.
Flip side, yeah. But what about, and I'm really thinking about this, Wilfred Owen, his Dulce et Decorum Est, his famous poem.
Yeah.
I mean, that's about as powerful a kind of an anti-war, don't buy the patriotism bullshit.
Yeah.
That kind of line, that's as powerful expression of that I've ever come across.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, I think some of the writers about Vietnam kind of took their lead from the World War I poets. That for America going to Vietnam, most of us were seeing John Wayne, and it took some horror to open our eyes to something else. But once that horror occurred, you look back and there was this whole generation of poets in World War I who had already kind of defined that turf in ways that were, excruciatingly painful and at the same time, highly artistic, and elevated the art to, or elevated the pain to a level of art that was redemptive.
Yeah.
So yeah, Vietnam books were and still are to some extent really interesting to me, and the kind of literature that I found there was a complete eye opener. It was so much better and more varied and very human.
Yeah. Well, you again, and I don't think all book dealers are great readers necessarily, but it sounds like you are.
I like to read, and that's what started me in books. And when I started being a scout, it was so I could get books that I wanted that I couldn't otherwise afford. And mostly, at the beginning at least, those weren't books I wanted as a collector. They were books I wanted because I wanted to read them.
Right.
And then my collections became the people I liked to read, and so I had collections of all these various modern authors.
Raymond Carver's the one
Carver.
Just simply because he was teaching at that college, right?
Yeah, he was teaching at Goddard.
Did you go and get him to sign everything, or?
No, because I didn't get my stuff of his until after this. He was there for the summer that I was there for the summer, and then after the summer ended, I started collecting his books.
Right.
And Richard Ford was there, and I started collecting his books. And John Irving I had started reading and really liked, and he was supposed to come up and give a reading there, but when The World According to Garp was so successful, he bailed on the reading at Goddard because I think they paid $25 to a writer to show up for a reading, and he didn't need the $25 that badly anymore. But I saw Tim O'Brien there the year before Going After Cacciato was published, and he gave a reading in a room smaller than the one we're in now. There were about 12 of us in it, in a basement room at Goddard, and he was reading from Going After Cacciato, which is a work in progress. And I remember thinking at the time...
That won the National Book?
It did. It won the National Book Award. And it was kind of a magical realist novel that was partly in Vietnam, but partly in this character's imagination, an overland walk away from the war to Paris. But he was reading a section of it that, as I was sitting there, I was thinking, this is as close as I ever want to get to napalm. I mean, it was so vivid, the writing that he was reading there.
Well, it's so kind of horrific.
Just absolutely horrific and vivid. I mean, how do you convey napalm in words. Well, he did. You know, I mean, it was a miracle what he could do with words.
So again, this is an example of an author that really spoke to you, and you said to yourself, "I got to get a hold of everything he's written."
That's right. Yeah.
And he's going to be an important writer down the road.
Yeah, you know, I mean, the latter was something I thought he's already an important writer, but you know, he doesn't have much to show for it. And as it turns out, his first book had been published. It was a memoir of Vietnam, and it kind of faded into obscurity. It got good reviews, and then just died because at the time nobody wanted to read about that stuff. You know, we were getting out of Vietnam, and we were perfectly happy to put the blinkers on and not look at it if we didn't have to. But that book, you know, came to be worth a good deal of money. I think at one point I sold copies of it for $3,000 or so.
Which the
If I Die in a Combat Zone was his first book. And now that book is probably worth at best a third of that, if not less. You know,
just what
copies are more available, and
because of the internet.
People who want them are fewer and farther between now because he's a little bit more in the past and not in the present, and so forth. You know.
What about the actual collectors of Vietnam literature? Does that go in an ebb and flow? I mean, is it?
You know, I think my experience with modern literature of all sorts, including Vietnam literature, is that there is a kind of ebb and flow, and you tend to see more people discover a writer or discover a field as it's being written about actively, or as a writer's coming out with new books. And then if they die, like Raymond Carver, for example, you know, for a little while his reputation is steady, but then after a while there's a whole new generation of readers who never experienced a new Raymond Carver book. I mean, all his books are in their past, and they don't even really recognize the name necessarily unless Library of America does a volume of his stuff or something like that. I had a funny story. It's not book-related per se, but I was dealing with Mario Puzo's archive, and one of the key elements of it were the materials for the Godfather movie. And there was a part of the script where they asked where one character was, and he's dead. And then Puzo had crossed it out and written in red ink, "He's with the fishes." And it was one of the famous lines from The Godfather, "He's sleeping with the fishes." And so here's this handwritten sheet where he's actually made that change. And so I was talking with a young collector, who very cultured young guy and actually knew quite a bit about movies as well, and I was recounting this story. He said, "Yeah, I think I've heard of that, The Godfather." You know, and I'm going, here's the number one film on the AFI's top 100 for the 20th century, and a young collector for whom it was, 30 years before his birth, has heard of it. Well, you know, that's like me having heard of something from 1920. You know, you could understand why it wouldn't be front and center in my consciousness, even if it was pretty important. And that's what I found, is that there's a whole new younger generation of readers and collectors for whom a lot of the names from the 60s, 70s, 80s are kind of historical, and they're not immediate the way they are for those of us who lived through those years. And
so what do they collect now? Recent authors,
I think
obviously, I guess?
Collect some recent authors. But again, I think that new books are so much more widely available and readily available than they used to be, that I think there are a lot of things, collecting book arts, for example, finely bound things, or collecting artist books where the copies themselves are, works of art over and above the texts.
Those are expensive, though.
They are expensive, and that's not, where a beginning collector, it's not an entry level, but book arts can be moderately inexpensive as a way, and I think there are lots of collecting areas. Every year there's this book show at PS1, the MoMA extension in Queens, that is, underground presses, small presses, things like that. I think they call it the New York Book Art Show or something like that. And we've had an antiquarian book fair on the same weekend a couple of times where the Antiquarian Book Fair will have, 70 dealers, and it'll have 800 people come through the door, in 2 days. And the MoMA will have 250 exhibitors and 20,000 people coming in. And they'll be buying things, and they'll be buying things that are $3.
Yeah, like little zines,
little
right?
zines, little graphic novels and things like that.
Yeah.
So I think there's this, incredible collecting interest. It's just bubbling up in places that didn't used to exist and are not yet really mainstream. So they're kind of invisible to a lot of us who are more mainstream. I liken it sometimes to what the Beats must have been like in around 1960. That, if you knew who Allen Ginsberg was in 1960, you were part of a small subculture that was way out of the mainstream. So if you had one of his small books, or if you had, a manuscript sheet or something, you'd be in seventh heaven, and most mainstream book collectors would look at you like, what?
And you probably paid peanuts for it.
Yeah,
too.
yeah. I mean, there was a dealer from New Haven who used to go over to Europe and North Africa and buy manuscripts from Burroughs and Ginsberg and those people, including sections of Naked Lunch, and he'd give them like $25, and then they would all go into a library. But that's how some of the great beat collections that are institutionalized here were built. They were built before those people were famous and their works were widely, universally considered important.
Yeah.
So they got them for pennies,
Let's just move back to Vietnam if we can.
Sure.
You're saying that the sort of the value of these books now are the same as they were 10 years ago, or less? Or?
Individually, probably mostly less,
Mm-hmm.
because it's easier to find most of them. The ones that were hard to find back then, if they exist at all today, are probably easier to find. And, for books from that era, there's kind of a downward spiral of prices, because if there are 10 copies online, you don't want to put your book online and be the 11th copy sold. You want to be the next copy sold.
Yeah.
So you're going to price it just a little underneath it. So there's that ratcheting downward of prices. Mm-hmm. And most of the modern books, even if they were somewhat scarce, they had first printings in the thousands of copies. And if you could only see what's in your local bookstore in a couple of dealers' catalogs over the course of a year, you might never see them. But if you can see every dealer's inventory, on your computer in your living room, you're going to see 10 copies. 10 copies in a country the size of the U.S. is a very rare book, but it doesn't look rare online. It looks like it's common. It looks like there are 10 of them, and there may not be 10 customers for that book at this point. So that, those books are often priced very low because the sellers want to be the next copy to sell, and they don't think there's necessarily a huge demand for them, and there isn't.
So you were saying that the real value of these Vietnam books is sort of in aggregate.
I think so. I think.
And you put together a big collection. Is that right?
A few times, yeah.
A few times, and then sold it to institutions. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And also sold individual books to institutions once they had started collecting to fill in their collections.
So you basically, probably not single-handedly, but you made the case for these kinds of books to the institutional collector and
tried to, yeah. Usually the institutions, the case would be made by somebody in the institution,
right? And
then, they could buy from me,
right? So as opposed to a bookseller, you are a bookseller, but you're undertaking the role of a book collector and then a seller.
In a way, yeah. And I did that with Native American stuff as well.
Yes, yeah.
For the same kind of reason, that it seemed underrepresented, but it seemed really, really interesting to me. And once I read this one book, Ceremony by Leslie Silko, which I thought was one of the best books I'd ever read, and partly because of the way it was infused with a Native American perspective, I wanted to see what else had been written, and it wasn't that easy to find out, and some of them were not that easy to find, even once you knew about them and so forth. It became just a really interesting field to me, and
Yeah, you write about the fact that they're kind of books that were written by white people. Or let me get this straight. They were basically critical of the native communities once they came back to them from being in the schools that they were sort of dragged out of.
Yeah, yeah.
To discourage others from going back to their communities and encourage them to integrate into.
Yeah, that was a national policy.
And those kinds of books were distributed by the U.S. government.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
would that
Well,
that'd be part of your collection?
Well, sometimes yes, but mostly no, because mostly those books were written by white people, and I was trying to find books that were written by Native Americans.
And now, specifically about their experiences of being exploited and...
Not necessarily. No. At first, yeah, that was a primary thing, or one of the primary elements, but, I get to the point where discovering that there was a Native American writer who wrote mystery novels in the 30s was just a great thing to discover. And, right now, there's Martin Cruz Smith. He's one of the great thriller writers of our era.
Yeah.
He's partly Native American. He doesn't write about that, but... that
he counts then?
I think he does. Yeah. I think that I don't think that Native American writers must be confined to only writing about Native American issues.
Yeah.
I think that's ghettoizing them in a way that is totally unfair. And I happen to think, I think generally it's thought of in kind of liberal circles that Native American literature is a legitimate subset of American literature. And I happen to think that American literature is a subset of Native American literature.
Right. That's going to make you very popular with Native Americans.
Well, I think it covers everything that American literature covers, and it covers stuff that American literature doesn't cover. So which is the subset of which?
Yeah, yeah. So again, with this collection, you went out and you developed a comprehensive collection, which you then in turn sold to an institution, correct?
I did these catalogs and sold some big chunks to institutions, but didn't have one institution to buy the whole thing.
Right.
The closest I got to that was, I think I ended up doing 6 Native American catalogs, and the third or fourth of them was one that, while it was at the printer, we had sent out like 6 sets of advance sheets to institutions, and 3 of the institutions bought so much of it that we canceled the printing.
That's
because
great.
there weren't going to be enough books left to pay the printer bill.
Right, right.
And so that was great. But that was also, I don't know if this story's in the ABA video, but one of those catalogs was also kind of my eye-opening event for the internet, where a librarian called me up and said, "Thank you so much for the Native American catalog. I found 2/3 of the books on the internet for 1/3 of the price."
Right.
And,
What an asshole.
Well, yes and no. I think, I wasn't sure if he was being kind to me. I think he was being an asshole deliberately.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
But I think he did me a huge favor by kind of informing me or educating me at that early a moment that the rules had suddenly changed about what information was available and what books were available.
So how did you adapt?
Well, one of the things turned out to be that I couldn't afford to do Native American catalogs anymore, because the more common books, I couldn't afford to price them $3 and $4 and so forth.
Right.
And it was hard enough to get the really rare ones and the expensive ones, and either you had to hold them for long enough to let them build up to be a catalog size, or else if you sold them off, then you would sell them off and never acquire enough to create a catalog. Right. So that's really what happened, that we moved away from the more common ones into ones that were considerably more scarce or rare, but never had enough of them to have the critical mass for a specialty subject catalog. We just put them into a section in our regular catalogs, and that's what we still do.
But you did still put out six catalogs. Yeah.
Native American stuff.
Yeah.
And they were fun because, I got to know some of the writers. I handled some of their archives. I sold Leslie Silko's papers for her and a few others. And so I got them to write introductions for the catalogs as well, which are these mini essays
Yeah.
that that don't appear anywhere else and that are interesting views of the subject of Native American literature written by a Native American writer.
Right.
And so that was fun to do. And
Yeah. Incidentally, another poet who comes to mind is Wallace Stevens' anti-war poems.
Mm-hmm.
Is there much poetry written about Vietnam?
Not much, but some. And
good.
some of it's very, very good.
Huh. Like what?
I did a top 25 list of Vietnam books
Yeah.
as a way to kind of enter the collecting field, and one of them was a book of poems that came out as a paperback original called The Long War Dead by Brian Alec Floyd. I just found it tremendously moving that every poem had impact. They covered a really wide range of kinds of experiences because each poem was about one person or one set of experiences. That to me is what poetry can do. I was listening to somebody the other day talking about it, and he was saying if there was a better way to say this, then you wouldn't need poetry.
That's right. You can't paraphrase poetry.
Right. If there isn't, then you need it. And I found that book, among others, but that one in particular, to be one where every poem packed a powerful punch.
I've also been thinking about, like, okay, you've done Vietnam and Native Americans. Do you continually try to come up with new projects to then develop so you're really doing a lot of hard work.
I should, but I really don't. Not as much as I think I ought to. Those two both came very organically to me. They just came following my nose. Right now, our latest list had for the first time, a section of climate fiction. Now, climate fiction is starting to be a thing, both among new published books and also as a way to look back on certain, mostly science fiction books of the past that have to do with climate. I just happened to read a book a couple of years ago that had a kind of science fiction-y premise having to do with climate, and then it was like that the southern U.S. had been declared kind of a non-country, and the border was established, through Tennessee or something, because of this ongoing series of hurricanes that one after another. And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting concept.
Yeah.
And then last year in the Caribbean, there were those like two Category 5 hurricanes within 2 weeks, which followed big ones that had come before and a couple of ones afterwards, where that seemed like we may not be that far from that. I mean, this may start to be an element of mainstream fiction in the very near future, as opposed to science fiction.
Well, Margaret Atwood wrote Mad Adam, which is the same idea.
Yeah. So I mean, that's something that the book that I read was good enough that to find out that there were other books kind of using some of these same ideas and exploring some of these same questions, I could see becoming a reader of that genre of fiction. And if I were, then that would be a place to start collecting and trying to see what else has there been done. And
well, it's in the news every single day.
Well, exactly.
It's so top of mind with this, with our generation, and also the next one.
One of the books we had on a recent list that was about climate, it was a nonfiction book, but the person who wrote it was a novelist, and he was saying, our failure to deal with climate change effectively so far has really been a failure of imagination. We can't really imagine the extent or the scope of what this could mean, and because of that, fiction is probably the best vehicle for exploring those things. And it's the first time it occurred to me that, fiction might be the only way to really wrap your brain around ideas that are too comprehensive in their impact to really get a good, objective perspective on.
Right.
So.
Well, they're unthinkable too.
Exactly.
The thing.
Yeah. So, in that sense, that seems like an area where, if people are writing interesting books about that, I'd like to find out, using those ideas, and I think I'd enjoy reading them.
Yeah, it's funny. You seem to me to be more like a literary critic than a bookseller.
Well, I wouldn't trust my criticism very far.
Well,
But
but you bet on your own criticism, though.
Well, that's true. That's right. Yeah. And I would trust it that far that, if something is compelling enough to me to move me, that there's something good and important that author has done. And I'd like to figure out how to recognize it and acknowledge it and also let other people know about it, if I can.
Right.
One of my favorite authors of all time was Robert Stone.
Yeah.
And I still can't quite find the two sentences to describe what is so great about his writing, but it is.
Did you do his bibliography? Or
I did, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And that was partly an attempt to be able to come up with the concept of what it is that makes his writing so powerful to me. I'd like to be able to say what it is, because then I think other people could discover it and would share it. And I think whatever he had was precious and way more valuable than we've recognized yet in terms of a perspective on our lives and the world.
Again, that's the motivation often of a literary critic is to bring attention to under-recognized
Right, yeah.
authors. One of the things that I was thinking of was, it wasn't obviously not as long-term as Vietnam, but it was still pretty significant, and that's 9/11. Have you looked at that at all?
I thought about that, and I haven't looked at that as a subject matter theme, but I've had this vague idea in my head that I read a lot of mysteries. I've had this vague idea in my head that mysteries changed on 9/11, that pre-9/11 mysteries are one thing and post-9/11 mysteries are something different. And I'm not sure yet how to characterize those things. But I also think that if there is any truth to that in mysteries, it's almost certainly going to also be true in mainstream literature, lots of other places. And, it's a little facile to say, well, before 9/11 we were innocent and now we're not, because we're Americans and we've almost never been innocent and we've always claimed it. But there is something that makes pre-9/11 books seem antiquated in a certain way. Maybe a little bit oblivious or something, in a way that post-9/11 books can't afford to be and wouldn't dare to be, is kind of how I see it. So it's not so much 9/11 itself, but that its impact has had this kind of reverberation in ways that I think are there, but I'm not quite sure how to say it or to prove it.
But you can't collect that. You can't collect that. You can collect books about 9/11.
Right.
And have you looked at that at all?
I haven't,
I don't know if maybe it's still too
it's
early.
Possible. It's possible. I'm sure there have been several done. Don DeLillo did.
Yeah. Martin Amis did something. I'm trying to remember if it was fiction or nonfiction. But Second Plane or something like that was called.
Yeah, no, I'm sure there are things that to be collected. It may also be true that it's too early to come up. Some of the greatest Vietnam books, were written 35 years afterwards because it took that long to digest it and, be able to write effectively about it. But I'm not so sure you can't collect post-9/11 mysteries, for example. I think there's a kind of an American noir that has come into being in the post-9/11 era that is very different from what was pre-9/11. If it's close to anything, it may be close to the noir of the post-World War II era, and it may even have similar reasons for being. But it's one of those things where history doesn't repeat itself, but it's kind of like a spiral. So it's similar to that, but imbued with a different amount of irony and things like that are now part of our literature in a way that weren't necessarily in the 40s and early 50s.
What are you looking at now, for sort of down, for the next 5 years, let's say? What collections are you putting together? What catalogs are you doing any theme stuff, or is it more general? Or?
We've done little bits and pieces of theme things. We started doing some nature writing. We did a catalog of nature writing a few years back, but now we focused recently on unusual copies of books by John Burroughs, the early nature writer, for whom the John Burroughs Medal is named, which is given out for the best work of nature writing. And we came across some books on early wildlife photography, the turn of the century in England. A couple of brothers basically invented wildlife photography and basically said, you don't have to go out and shoot these animals. You can just go out and take pictures of them, and it's every bit as challenging and every bit as exciting and fun, and the animals end up alive. And they did, and they were famous for having the first picture of a bird's egg in a nest in the wild,
Yeah.
But one of their books has one of those covers, embossed covers with an illustration. This guy rappelling off a cliff with a gigantic camera and a tripod on his back while the seagulls fly below him,
Right.
They were adventurers. And
So this falls into just nature writing or
nature writing,
photography?
nature photography. I mean, this whole, one of the archives I'm working on is started out as a nature photography, and then it wound up morphing over into photojournalism around the time of Mount St. Helens eruption. And then from there, the guy tracking the resilience of the environment around Mount St. Helens got interested in climate change, and his archive is one of the great archives, photographic archives documenting climate change. So nature photography, photojournalism, climate change in a kind of seamless continuum. And it seems to me that that's an important set of connections, being attentive to the outside world, being kind of critical in terms of, attentive to the newsworthiness of things that's happening in the natural world, and then recognizing that climate change is affecting so much that, your average person wouldn't know about. I mean, I wouldn't know about coral unless somebody told me about it,
So who's your audience for this? Is it institutional, or is it...
It's mostly institutional for those kinds of things. These archives around here, they're all going to institutions, and in theory they have justifications, but, I'm hoping that there are individual collectors for whom these things resonate as well. And
Right.
We do have some collectors for this natural history stuff, and we sold a collection of John Burroughs books to Harvard, but we also sold John Burroughs books, some really cool copies, to a private collector. And he's one of those people who ultimately his collection will be the basis of some institutional collection. It'll probably be donated or sold, to a library in 20 or 30 years. And collectors, they do that. They collect these things before the institutions are aware of them or, have the critical mass to commit to them. So we're hoping, that we'll find people collecting these things that we find interesting and compelling and important, and to some extent we do see that.
Let's get to the collector then, and if they used the same sort of thinking process that you did with Vietnam and with Native Americans, and they've come up with an idea and they started collecting away with it. That's the thing. There's the fun of putting together. First of all, you have to sort of come up with parameters so that you can theoretically complete that.
Right, or know what to include and what to not include.
What not include, yeah. And then there's the fun of doing that, and then just, I guess, throwing it back in the ocean afterwards. Then there's doing something with it, like doing your own catalog as a collector and trying to do what you do. You're doing what a collector does, but you're obviously taking it to another level.
Yeah, but not even that much. I think I gave a talk a few years ago to a book collectors group. I think this was in Utah. And these were people who are serious collectors. I mean, they know their field 100 times better than I know their field. And they could care less about my modern literature for the most part, or Vietnam or whatever. They were serious book collectors. And so I wondered what I had to tell them that they wouldn't already know. What I realized was what most book collectors don't know, because book collecting is a very individual and personal pursuit, is there's a social dimension to what they're doing that is profound. And that has to do with the collection that they create, whatever its subject, can easily become the best or one of the best ever done in that subject. And by doing that, they're basically performing a social service. They're creating the possibility of a society learning something about these subjects that it doesn't know. And that's the thing I would say about collecting is it's not just the fun element of it. Mm-hmm. It's the fact that it's an opportunity to learn stuff you don't yet know. And once you learn that stuff, you now are an asset to society.
You are, but you need to do something with that learning.
Right.
You need to write it down. You have to produce some kind of, if it's a catalog, or if it's just sort of some dissertation on what you've learned.
Yeah, and a lot of collectors do that at the very highest levels. If you go to the Grolier Club or something like that, you'll see the Grolier Club publishes pamphlets and books by its members on their collections and the subjects of them.
Right.
But even if you don't get that far, if you end up selling or donating your collection to an institution, you've given that institution the opportunity to increase the body of knowledge and information available.
You've given
world.
Raw material
That's
to
right.
scholars.
That's right. And that, I mean, that's a great service.
Yeah.
And so there's this social dimension to it that is implicit, and people don't really see themselves as doing a social good necessarily by book collecting, but I do. I think
I do too, but I guess the thing is, how open are these institutions to the collectors? Like that's, I think one of the great things is for a library to encourage and cultivate their local collectors.
Sure.
Problem is, they can't accept all these collections.
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, these days libraries are very careful about what they try to accept or are willing to accept. But I think any collector who has pursued a collection with a kind of coherent and careful approach, like what you were saying, recognizing where the lines are, what to include, what not to include, if your collection really has that kind of a focus, the likelihood of a library recognizing it as a useful, valuable resource is much greater than if you just say, well, I'm going to try to collect signed first editions of modern writers, you know.
Yeah. So there needs to be a focus.
I think having a certain focus, and especially if it's a focus that's broad enough to be interesting and important, but narrow enough that you can actually learn it, you know, yourself, learn about it, and enough to, you know, expand the parameters as you understand it better, but not just throw it open to, you know, whatever comes your way. I mean, I think, you know, collections educate us as we create them, and then they educate other people when we pass them on.
So do you have clients who come to you and say, I've got this collection, can you sell it to an institution?
I've had that. It's hard to do. I've more often have helped them. If they're in the income bracket where they can use a tax break, I've helped them donate them and get a tax break.
Okay.
Selling collections as a whole is hard because if you find an institution that's interested in that, they're almost certain to have all the common stuff that's in the collection. So they
just want the top, the most
Yeah, they have a huge
esoteric
problem of duplication. And if they're not already collecting in that area, well, then it's probably because they don't want to, you know. You have to find the institution on the cusp of beginning to collect there to sell them a whole collection, and that's very hard. But donating collections, when they have a clear focus, is still can be done.
Yeah.
And institutions tend to be grateful for that.
on a fairly wide-scale basis.
Yeah, if the collections really are serious, you know,
Yeah.
just I think it's serious if you are able to use that collection to learn yourself.
Yeah.
That means other people could too.
Do you have a good example of a collection like that?
Yeah, I helped a lawyer, a conservation lawyer over near Boston, collected books on the history of conservation, the conservation movement in the U.S.
From certain year to certain year?
Yeah, from basically the beginning of it, which really is around the turn of the century, Teddy Roosevelt and so forth. And there was a first meeting about U.S. Conservation, and it was like held by the Geological Society or something like that. And he had the invitation to Teddy Roosevelt from the, as part of it, a keystone of it. But he had a lot of Rachel Carson and so forth.
Okay.
And I did the appraisal for that and helped him donate it to a collection in Texas, at Texas Tech University, that's geared toward literature of the environment, and how the environment and community interact. And I've sold a lot of our authors' archives papers to that collection. Barry Lopez's papers went there, Rick Bass, a bunch of good nature writers and people. A poet, Patty Ann Rogers, whose poetry is very much nature inflected. And so, I arranged for the donation of his conservation collection to that collection there. And they were overjoyed, because they couldn't have afforded or justified the money that it would have cost, but he could afford to do it because it got him a tax break, which I'm sure didn't remotely pay for what he had paid for the collection, but his collection became part of, this learning institution.
Plus maybe his name goes on it. And
exactly.
All that. Yeah.
So that was great. I was very lucky to do that, and they were lucky to get his books. And, he was a serious collector. He worked on it for a long time, and ended up being one of those people who knew way more about the subject that he was collecting than I did. I could sometimes find things he didn't have that fitted with his collection, but he was very much more knowledgeable. And the collection enabled that kind of knowledge for him, and it will do that for others in the future. Where it is now.
That's a very interesting way of just thinking about your collection. Is it something that people or the scholars can learn from? That's a really important question to ask.
I think so. I really do. I think that puts you in a continuum and means that your collection will outlive you. But the importance of it is the importance you created. There's a kind of immortality in a certain way for a collector to build a collection that becomes useful to succeeding generations. And I think
any other questions like that you might pose as a collector?
I think one of the things that is, for me, the most interesting is, can I learn from this? And if the answer is yes, then it means the collection is kind of helping you retain a sense of humility in the face of the knowledge of the world. And I think that's a good thing. I think the idea that we can continue to learn, we don't yet know it all, that's one of the things books can give us, is this, very concrete awareness that, our knowledge falls short and it can be improved upon day by day. And by doing so, we're not just, I'm not just educating myself and then it all disappears when I die. If I have a book collection that's being created out of that, then that education that I got out of it is now available for others too.
Yeah.
So I think that in that sense, book collectors do this great social good that really goes under the radar for the most part, but shouldn't. It should be recognized that what they're doing has a social dimension that's really, really important.
And yet, the vast majority of book collectors' collections get tossed back in the ocean. 95%, I would think.
Yeah. Well, in a certain way, there's a danger of list collecting, which is a fun thing to do, collect all the Pulitzer Prizes. But, there are already collections that have all of them, so you're not going to really add to the knowledge of the world by doing so. So in that sense, back in the ocean, or at least back to the auction house or to the bookseller and dispersed to be recycled into another generation of collectors.
But the point is to come up with some original thinking beforehand on your own, and something that turns your crank.
Yeah, that's right. That's one of the points. If you can do that or want to do that, I think it's really rewarding, because I think the idea that I can be learning every day I think that's a great idea. That my learning didn't stop in high school or college. And books, do that. They reward you with that possibility.
Just winding down, before the interview started, you mentioned that 50 to 60, 70% of your income or revenue these days is coming from author archives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's been a part of your business plan, I guess, over the years.
Well, I sold my first one in 1992, so I'd already been selling books for a while before that, but that's 27 years ago now. So since then, it's been a part of my business. It's been more a part of my business for two reasons. The internet made a lot of the modern books that I sold previously much more widely available and not really capable of being sold the way I had been via catalog and so forth, worth enough to justify that. But also, a whole generation of writers has come of age to the point where they're now on the downside of their career. Their archive is maybe not complete, but mostly complete. They're looking for a place to preserve it. Or they've died, like several of the writers' papers are here now. These are the final updates to archives that I'd sold earlier, but they kept things that they needed while they were alive, and now they've died. So I'm working on getting their final papers to the institutions that bought the archives to begin with. So, those two things have combined to mean that there, at least for the moment, there are a lot of writers whose papers I'm dealing with, and there are fewer books than there were prior to the internet for me to deal with as rare book catalogs when your focus is modern literature.
So that sort of propelled you in the direction of...
It did,
author, yeah.
And it also propelled me in the direction of some of the other fields like this nature photography and things like that. Those books aren't as common, and especially if one of the things we've tried to do for a long time, even before the internet, was not just have the text, the first edition of the text, but have a copy that had some story about the copy itself, if possible.
What do you mean?
So that, an association copy that was given by a writer to a friend, or a copy. We had the copy of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest that Ken Kesey had to revise because of a lawsuit filed against him by one of the characters in the book. There's a story that, was very little known, but Kesey told me about it, and I thought he was pulling my leg because I'd never heard of it, and I collected Kesey. I thought I would know about this if it had happened, but it had happened, and all the individuals involved had these non-disclosure agreements, so it was never publicized. And I found out about it from him and pursued it and tracked it down, and eventually wound up with a copy that he had used to make all the changes that had to be made to satisfy this lawsuit. And so, that was an example of a copy of a book that was more than just the first edition. One of the books, the coolest book I think I've ever handled, was somebody had bought the editor's copy of the proofs of The Lord of the Rings at auction when the editor had died. And they had kind of gone under the radar because the editor was totally unknown. The way Tolkien did his final revisions, they sent him the proofs, and he would read 10 pages and mark them up and tear them out and send them to his editor. So this was a big stack of loose pages of proofs torn up. And the fact that Tolkien had reworked them extensively was less obvious than it was a jumble of mess. And so this book dealer bought it, sorted through it to piece it back together as the 3 volumes, took it to the best bookbinder in America and put a jeweled binding on the 3 volumes that when you laid them out flat was a picture of Mordor and the dragon Smaug, and encrusted with jewels. And it had the final changes Tolkien made to the book in his hand, including the epigraph for the whole book is the inscription on the inside of the ring. And after it had been typeset, he changed it because he liked he just didn't like the wording as well.
Right.
And so, here's the most famous line in the most famous, book kind of thing. And for a brief moment, I owned it and handled it and got to see it and just got to live that moment where he was rewriting this critical element of this great series of books. So,
would that be part of your advice to the collector then? Is Don't necessarily just go after a first edition. Save your money. Instead of buying 4 or 5 first editions, buy an association copy.
Yes. I've been pitching that for a long time. There's been this argument in the modern book trade about, is it better to just have a signature or is it better to have an inscription? And I've always come down on the side of the more writing by the author in the book, the better.
Yeah.
And if it's writing that has substance to it, and or it's addressed to someone, of some importance to you or to the writer or, whatever, that you can figure out. And these days you can figure out a lot more easily than you used to be able to.
Yeah.
I would say lots of times great association copies come up for not very much money.
Where?
On the internet and people's catalogs. It's one of these things where there'll be 12 signed copies of a book online. So, the top copy is $45. And it happens one of those 12 is a fabulous association copy, and the other 11 are just more or less just autographs. But they're not priced differently frequently.
Interesting.
So that,
So in other words, you've got a unique copy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If you can't have the manuscript,
Yeah.
you've got something that is essentially almost as unique.
Yeah.
And that's very doable. I tell people this is the golden age of book buying, because all us dealers are forced to keep our prices as low as we can stand it because there's so much competition.
Right.
And what that means is a lot of really great stuff slips through at very modest prices. And if you can recognize what appeals to you and know why it appeals to you, you can build great collections, very, modestly priced books that, taken out of this market, would make total sense for them to be much more expensive.
How long is this market going to last for then?
I think it's here for good.
Okay.
I really do. I thought at first it was going to be just until the dealers who had non-internet inventory prior to the internet, until that inventory was exhausted. But now it's become the modus operandi of, you get a book, you check out how many copies are online, you price yours accordingly in hopes of selling, and that there are not always copies online. It seems like there are always copies online, but lots and lots of books are not represented online at all. But of the ones that are, especially modern books, that the prices tend to be very modest and driving downward all the time. So that gives the book buyer, great opportunities. There's something about wanting to be sure you have an idea of what you want, and then having the confidence in your own idea to recognize that this really is a great thing for $45, whereas this autographed one for $45 or $40 is just an autographed copy. There's nothing especially wonderful about it. And I still get a kick out of every book that we have that has a story it tells.
Yeah. This is a specific question, and we can go on. I don't have to. I can take it out. I can edit it.
Okay,
but if it's a problem, but I was very interested to see that Michael Ondaatje sold his archive, and you handled it, right, to the Harry Ransom Center last year. And no, I don't begrudge him at all, trying to get as much as he can for his life's work.
Right.
But in Canada, there wasn't a peep out of anywhere expressing concern that this iconic Canadian writer's material, life's work, had gone down to the States. It was nothing. There was one piece on a CBC website that could have been written by the media relations people. So my question is, did anyone express any interest in purchasing his?
No, that's the thing. It's like they're not budgeted to do that. So they knew they wanted his papers for sure, but he would have had to give them to them, basically. Mm-hmm. I had a thing years ago. I had a bunch of Garcia Marquez manuscripts, and it was a national scandal that these had migrated up to some wealthy gringo bookseller, and as opposed to being in Colombia. but they came from his sister. He had given them to her. Columbia, the National Library wanted them, but she could use the money, and they weren't going to purchase them. And so they called me up basically to ream me out and make me the butt of their. It was a feature story in Semana, which was the Time magazine of Colombia at that point. I spent 2 or 3 hours on the phone with my fractured Spanish, explaining to them that this was really the only way to preserve this stuff was to get it where somebody was going to pay money for it, and therefore almost have to take really good care of it because, they expended so much lucre on it. And, so it didn't change the whole framework of the article, but they put a sidebar in that basically you had my whole rationale for this. And, I think that's been the case, really this thing of valuing these kinds of archives this way and paying for them has been a pretty strictly American phenomenon. Now, it's recently you've started to see it in Britain. It's happened some.
Well, they've finally, I guess, got some kind of budget to keep it in the country.
Well, exactly. And you're seeing that elsewhere in Europe. They're beginning to get a sense that, if this stuff is worth keeping, then it's worth paying for. It's worth budgeting for, and not just expecting
it's the kind of the identity of the country.
Well, exactly.
And
if you don't care about that, or you demand that you get it for free, aren't you insulting the stuff that's the very identity of your country?
Well, that's the thing that got me, and it gets me. It still gets me. The fact that there was no one, and Ondaatje is one of a handful of the greatest Canadian writers ever.
Yeah. He was aware of that too, but he knew that I think he had given some of his papers to the National Archives there.
That's what they told me. He'd given them stuff from 62 to 93, they said. Mm-hmm. It sounded like it was a ton of stuff.
There was a fair amount of stuff. I remember now because the early stuff especially, there was early stuff going all the way back to the late 50s, and that's what went to the Ransom Center. But during that early, the 60s and 70s, it was pretty thin. There were, a lot of the bulk was not there.
That's interesting. So they probably got a lot of good stuff in the National Library in Canada.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe that was part of their thinking is, we've already got all this stuff. Right. We're not going to pay from whatever it is, the extra stuff.
Right. I think that's true, and it in a sense it's funny because the Ransom Center exists, as I understand it, because one guy, Harry Ransom, in the 1950s, came up with the question of what can we at the University of Texas do that we can do better than anybody else in the world, because we're Texans and we want to be.
Right, yeah.
And they figured out that nobody in the world was systematically collecting great literary manuscripts and great literary manuscript archives.
And also writers that were still alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They were going after that.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that was groundbreaking.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
And think of who was still alive at that point.
Yeah.
Hemingway and Faulkner and, that whole generation were still around. So, they created that, and, they're the best repository in the world at this point of literary manuscripts, at least in English.
They must still have a ton of money. Like they invested it well, I guess, or something.
I don't really know how it works. I think I talked with Steve Ennis, the director, shortly after he became director of the Ransom Center, and he was saying, people think we have all the money in the world, but the fact is there's so much good stuff being offered to us every week. We don't have all that kind of money. We can't buy everything that's great out there that's being offered to us. Plus, every time we do make one of these big purchases, it's a project. We have to put together, it doesn't just all come out of our library budget. We find the donors, we find the department and the university and blah, 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 so that they're projects. They're put together. I'm sure they have a very good budget, but they also create these combinations of sources And sometimes, you know, universities get donations of money that can only be used to buy James Joyce, you know, or that kind of thing. And so they have those kinds of things that they can fit them into one or another purchase they do. So it's, you know, it's an adventure. It's not always easy. And, you know, they sometimes want to buy something, but only if they can defer the payment until X, because they've used up this fiscal year's allotment. They don't have time to put together a project for this during the current fiscal year. So they have a lot of money, and they spend a lot of money, but they, you know, there's a lot of great stuff out there, and
They can't get it all.
they got Ondaatje's papers right after they got Ishiguro's papers. They were both, you know, good size archives and a pretty penny for each. And you know, there's a limit to how many times you can do that in a year.
You still enjoying what you're doing?
I am, you know, it's like I'm still learning, and
That sounds like a pretty important theme in your life.
well, you know, if that weren't the case, then I'm not sure I would be enjoying it, because, I mean, it is fun to see these. If you saw some of the things in some of these boxes, the writer's stuff, it's just fabulous. And, you know, Robert Stone, as I said, was one of my favorite writers, and I saw a bunch of some letters to him. I saw some work he did with another writer I knew about that I never knew he had collaborated with, and things like that, you know, are just great. It's really cool to get an insight into what these writers are doing that doesn't eventually bubble up into a published work, but is still nonetheless really interesting, you know, and bears on some of the same issues and themes that their writing focuses on. So
What are you reading right now that's blowing your socks off? Anything?
I'm reading J.K. Rowling's latest book written as Robert Galbraith.
And?
Well, it's the fourth one, and I've read the other three, and it's a 650-page mystery, and it's good. She's a great storyteller and a really, really good writer, and I have this feeling that her Harry Potter series not only saved a whole generation from not being readers, but I think she saved reading altogether, because if that generation had not become readers, the successive ones wouldn't have either, and they did become readers because of Harry Potter. But
That's huge, isn't it?
I think it's huge.
Yeah.
I think it's gigantic, and I'm super glad she's a multi-gazillionaire or whatever she is, because that's a great thing to have done. And I doubt she was ever ambitious enough to be trying to do that, but I think that's what she did. And I have a daughter who was in that age when it could have migrated strictly over into handheld devices, and, you know, never a book crossed a lap. And
I've read pretty well all of them aloud to my daughter.
yeah. I read.
That's the same thing.
It is absolutely. And I've read them. My daughter's read them. I've listened to them through twice at least on books on tape, whatever.
Yeah.
Audible.com, and you know, they bear up. And so Rowling, at this point, I would trust anything she writes, because she's a really good storyteller. And her first Robert Galbraith mystery was just a very good mystery, you know, and this is too.
Great.
But what you did with Harry Potter is something for the ages, I think. I really do.
Well, thanks so much for...
Thank you for asking me. I really appreciate it.
I've been speaking with Ken Lopez, who is Antiquarian, used book dealer, and author archives dealer, based in Hadley, Massachusetts. Thanks again.
Thank you.